The night breathes differently in Prague, in the narrow streets where moonlight struggles to pierce the stone, where shadows seem to whisper secrets older than memory itself. There once lived a man who dared to court the very essence of transformation. His name was Edward Kelley, and in the year of our Lord 1586, he walked these cobbled paths with the weight of impossible promises heavy upon his shoulders. The Emperor Rudolph II had summoned him to his court, drawn by tales that defied the natural order. Gold, they said. Gold spun from the basest of metals, lead transformed through fire and will into the currency of gods. In the labyrinthine corridors of Prague Castle, where tapestries hung like secrets and candles burned with the persistence of prayer, the Emperor had grown drunk on possibility. Here was a monarch who collected wonders as other men collected coins, automata that moved without strings, paintings that seemed to breathe, and now, perhaps, the greatest treasure of all, a man who claimed dominion over the fundamental laws of creation. Kelley walked those halls with the careful steps of one who knows he treads upon the edge of worlds. His face bore the mark of his pastan ear, cropped close to his skull, punishment for some forgotten crime that had branded him as surely as fire brands flesh. Yet in his eyes burned something that made emperors forget such earthly concerns. He spoke of the great work with the fervor of a prophet, his words weaving through the air like incense, heavy with promise and dark with implication, where stone walls grew thick and sounds died before they could escape. Here, in rooms that had once housed grain and wine, Kelley built his kingdom of glass and fire. Furnaces roared day and night, their flames dancing with colors that had no names, blues that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, greens that shifted like living jade, and always, always, the deep crimson that spoke of blood and sacrifice. The air itself grew heavy with his work. Servants who ventured too close spoke of scents that made their heads swim, metallic temps that coated the tongue, sweet corruption that reminded them of flowers left too long in tombs, and underneath it all, something that smelled of lightning and fear. The stone walls themselves seemed to weep with condensation, as though the very castle perspired in anticipation of what might emerge from those sealed doors. Rudolph visited often in those early days, his robes rustling with excitement as Kelley showed him vessels filled with quicksilver that moved like trapped moonlight, powders that glowed with their own inner fire, and always the promise soon, very soon, the lead would sing its song of transformation and emerge as gold pure as sunlight. The Emperor's eyes would grow wide with hunger as he watched the alchemist work, his hands trembling not with age, but with the nearness of a dream made manifest. But as autumn deepened into winter, something changed in those hidden chambers. The sounds that escaped grew stranger, not merely the roar of flames and the bubble of boiling compounds, but other things. Whispers that seemed to come from the glass itself, low moaning that might have been wind through broken walls, or voices trapped within the very substance of matter. The servants began to cross themselves when they passed those doors, and even the rats, those bold companions of castle life, seemed to avoid the corridors that led to Kelley's domain. It was then that the rumors began to spread through Prague. Like plague through a crowded quarter, the baker's wife swore she had seen Kelley in the Jewish cemetery at midnight, digging with his bare hands among the headstones. The blacksmith spoke of strange orders, iron vessels designed to hold things that should not be held, with locks that seemed more suited to keeping things in than keeping thieves out. And from the castle itself came whispers that made even hardened soldiers pause in their cupstaleys, of things moving behind those locked doors, shadows that fell wrong in the candlelight, and sounds that no earthly furnace should make. The transformation Kelley spoke of was indeed taking place, but perhaps not the one the emperor had commissioned. His early promises of gold began to take on darker hues. The vessels he showed to Rudolph now contained liquids, thick as honey, but dark as dried blood, powders that seemed to shift and writhe when no wind stirred them, and metals that hummed with their own strange music when pressed about the gold. Kelley would smile with lips that had grown pale from breathing his own vapors, and speak of greater transformations, of work that went beyond mere metal into the very essence of life itself. The city began to feel his presence like a fever. Animals sickened in the quarters nearest the castle, their eyes growing cloudy and their movements sluggish until they simply lay down and refused to rise. Children woke screaming in the night, speaking of dreams filled with glass and fire and things that should not have faces but did. Even the Vltava River seemed to run darker where it passed beneath the castle walls, as though something in its waters had been forever changed. It was in the deepest part of winter, when snow lay heavy on the rooftops and the very air seemed to crack with cold, that the final transformation began. Those few who dared venture near Kelley's chambers spoke of lights that pulsed through the walls like a vast heartbeat, and sounds that suggested not one voice but many, crying out in languages that predated human speech. The stone itself seemed to grow warm despite the bitter cold, and moisture ran down the walls like tears of condensation or something more disturbing still. Rudolph, his initial enthusiasm curdled into growing unease, demanded to see results. The gold. Where was the gold that had been promised? But when he arrived at the chambers that night, flanked by guards whose hands trembled on their swords, he found Kelley changed. The alchemist's eyes had taken on the quality of molten glass, reflecting light in ways that eyes should not. His skin bore a pallor that spoke not of illness, but of fundamental alteration, as though he had begun to transform into something that borrowed the shape of humanity, but was no longer entirely human. The gold, Kelley whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that made the emperor's teeth ache, is not in the metal, your majesty. It is in the change itself. In the moment when one thing becomes another, when the boundaries dissolve and what was impossible becomes inevitable. He gestured toward vessels that lined the chamber walls, each filled with substances that moved with their own purpose. I have found the true great work, not the making of gold, but the making of making itself. The emperor fled. History does not record the words that passed between them in that final moment, but by morning Kelley's chambers had been sealed with iron and stone, their contents locked away behind walls that still stand today. The alchemist himself was taken in chains to a tower room, there to contemplate the distance between his dreams and the cold reality of stone floors and barred windows. He died there, they say, though the manner of his death remains shrouded in the same mystery that had surrounded his life. Some claimed he threw himself from the window in despair, others that he simply faded away like one of his own vapors, dissolving into the very air he had spent so long trying to transform. But those who knew the castle best whispered of something else, that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind carried the right scents, sounds could still be heard from those sealed chambers, as though the great work continued, without its master, pursuing its own logic toward an end that mortal minds were not meant to comprehend. The legacy of Edward Kelley settled over Prague like sediment in still water. In the years that followed, other alchemists would come to the emperor's court, each promising their own version of transformation, their own pathway to gold. But none would be granted the freedom that Kelley had enjoyed, and none would dare to venture so far into the realm where matter itself bended to will. The chambers remain sealed still, their contents a mystery that may be too dangerous to solve. Yet Prague remembers. In the narrow streets, where shadows still whisper secrets, in the stone walls that have absorbed centuries of human dreams and failures, the memory of that winter lingers. Sometimes, when the wind carries the scent of distant fires and the light falls just so through ancient windows, one might catch an echo of what Edward Kelley truly discovered in those hidden chambers. Not gold, perhaps, but something far more precious and far more terrible. The knowledge that the boundaries between what is and what might be are thinner than we dare believe, and that some transformations, once begun, can never be undone. The story fades now into the deeper silence that follows all such tales, but the questions remain suspended in the Prague air, like incense that refuses to dissipate. What did he truly achieve in those chambers? What transformation did he undergo that so terrified an emperor who collected impossible things? And in the sealed darkness behind those walls, does something still pulse with its own rhythm, waiting for the day when iron and stone can no longer contain what mortal hands have wrought? The city keeps its secrets well, but on the coldest nights, when snow muffles sound and darkness presses close against the windows, Prague still breathes differently, as though somewhere in its stone heart the great work continues its patient alchemy, transforming not lead into gold, but reality itself, into something stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than we have ever dared imagine. In the hallowed halls of Bologna, where parchment whispered secrets to candlelight and knowledge wore the heavy robes of mortality, there existed books that no scholar dared approach without first making peace with death. The year was 1590, and the great library of San Domenico held within its shadowed alcoves volumes that bore more than merely the weight of wisdom. They carried poison in their very fibers, death woven into their bindings like golden thread in a tapestry of doom. The air in those ancient corridors moved thick as honey, heavy with centuries of accumulated learning, and something else, a metallic taste that coated the tongue and made the throat close in recognition of danger. Here, among leather-bound tomes whose spines bore titles in languages that predated Christ, certain manuscripts waited with the patience of predators. Their pages had been prepared not merely with ink and intention, but with powders ground from stones that glowed in darkness and compounds that sang their own quiet songs of dissolution. Brother Tommaso discovered the first victim on a Tuesday morning when mist still clung to the library's arched windows like the breath of ghosts. Young Michel, a student whose hunger for ancient texts had brought him often to these sacred shelves, lay slumped over an open manuscript, his face bearing the peaceful expression of one who had simply fallen asleep while reading. But when Tommaso approached to wake him, he found skin cold as marble and lips tinged with the deep blue of medieval illumination, as though the very colors had leached from the pages into his blood. The book beneath Michel's still hands was a treatise on the properties of metals, its margins decorated with symbols that seemed to shift in the uncertain light. The parchment itself felt different beneath Tommaso's trembling fingers, rougher somehow, as though fine particles of something crystalline had been worked into its surface during its creation. When he lifted the volume to examine it more closely, a faint dust rose from its pages, sparkling briefly in the morning light, before settling back to invisibility. Word spread through the corridors with the swift certainty of plague. The young student had been healthy, robust, with no signs of illness or weakness. Yet something in that book had reached out to claim him, drawing him into a sleep from which no earthly power could wake him. The other scholars gathered around the manuscript with the fascination of men staring into an open grave, drawn to understand what had transformed their colleague from seeker of knowledge into escape. A warning written in flesh and silence. Father Benedetto, the library's keeper, and a man whose learning spanned decades of careful study, examined the volume with tools rather than hands-long wooden probes that kept his flesh distant from whatever lurked within those prepared pages. Under magnification, the parchment revealed its secrets, slowly, like a confession extracted under duress. The surface bore a fine coating of something that glittered with its own inner light. Crystals so small they were barely visible to the naked eye, yet present in quantities that suggested deliberate preparation rather than accidental contamination. "Arsenic," he whispered to the assembled scholars, his voice carrying the weight of recognition and fear. But not merely arsenic, as physicians knew if this was something refined, concentrated, worked into the very substance of the book through processes that spoke of alchemical knowledge wedded to murderous intent. The margins bore traces of other compounds as well, powders that had been mixed with the inks themselves, so that the act of reading became an intimate dance with death. Each turned page, releasing its burden of poison into the air where hungry lungs would draw it deep. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern that chilled even those hardened by years of confronting mortality in their theological studies. 7 manuscripts, scattered throughout the library's collection, bore similar preparations. All dealt with forbidden knowledge, alchemical processes, medical texts that delved too deeply into the transformation of human flesh, philosophical treatises that questioned the nature of the soul itself. Each had been prepared with the same meticulous care, their pages dusted with compounds that made the simple act of scholarship into a form of slow suicide. The scholars who had died for Michel was not the first, merely the first to be discovered. In the act itself had all been drawn to these particular volumes by their own hunger for understanding. Their deaths had been attributed to fever, to weak constitution, to the mysterious ailments that claimed young men who spent too many hours in poorly ventilated chambers surrounded by ancient books. But now the pattern emerged like a message, written in funeral notices, and the true horror of the situation settled over the library like incense, thick with meaning. Who had prepared these books? The question haunted the corridors more effectively than any ghost. The volumes themselves were ancient, some predating the establishment of the library itself, suggesting that the poisoning had been done not by some recent hand, but by craftsmen whose knowledge of both bookmaking and murder had been passed down through generations of secretive practitioners. The bindings bore no maker's marks, the inks revealed no signatures under scrutiny, and the parchments themselves seemed to have been prepared in ways that left no trace of their origin. Brother Tommaso, whose discovery of Michelle's body had begun the investigation, found himself drawn repeatedly to contemplate the deeper implications. These were not random acts of malice, not the work of madmen seeking to spread death without purpose. The poisoned volumes had been chosen with care, their subjects carefully selected to attract specific kinds of seekers. Those who died had been scholars whose interests ran toward the dangerous margins of approved learning, men whose questions pushed against the boundaries of what the Church considered safe to know. Was this murder, or was it something else? A form of protection, perhaps, designed to ensure that certain knowledge remained forever beyond the reach of mortal minds. The books themselves seemed to embody a philosophical paradox, wisdom so dangerous that it could only be preserved by making its acquisition lethal, truth so powerful that it demanded the ultimate sacrifice from those who would possess it. The authorities sealed the affected volumes in iron chests, their locks blessed by bishops and their keys cast into the Tiber. But the library itself retained the memory of what had happened within its walls, and scholars began to approach their research with a new kind of reverence, knowing that some knowledge carried a price written in blood and silence. The very air seemed different now, charged with the awareness that learning itself could be weaponized, that the pursuit of understanding might lead not to enlightenment, but to a darkness from which no scholar would return. Yet still they came, drawn by the same hunger that had claimed their predecessors. For what is the human spirit, if not a flame that burns brighter when faced with prohibition? The poisoned pages had been removed, but their memory lingered like a challenge, daring future generations to consider whether any truth was worth the risk of dissolution, whether any wisdom justified the transformation from seeker into warning in the deep hours of night, when candles burned low and shadows gathered thick around the reading desks. Some claimed they could still sense the presence of those deadly manuscripts. Not physically, those had been sealed away beyond reach, but spiritually, as though the very concept of poisoned knowledge had taken root in the library's stones and mortar. The books that remained seemed to pulse with their own careful warnings, reminding each reader that the act of learning was itself a form of alchemy, transforming the seeker in ways that might prove irreversible. The final irony was not lost on those who survived to contemplate it. The poisoned books had been designed to protect their secrets by ensuring that those who approached them would die before they could share what they had learned. But in dying, the victims had created a different kind of knowledge, the understanding that some forms of wisdom were too dangerous for mortal hands, that the pursuit of truth could become indistinguishable from the embrace of death itself. Library stands still, its shelves heavy with volumes that whisper their contents to candlelight and careful hands. But somewhere in its deeper archives, locked away in chambers that few are permitted to enter, iron chests contain mysteries that may never be solved. The poisoned pages wait in their metal tombs, their deadly wisdom preserved not for reading, but as monuments to the terrible marriage of knowledge and mortality. Reminders that some transformations are too profound for human consciousness to contain. The scholars are gone now, claimed by time, if not by poison, but their questions linger in the air like incense that refuses to dissipate. What truths were worth dying for? What knowledge demanded such extreme protection? And in the silence that follows such questions, the library keeps its counsel, holding its secrets as carefully as a grave holds its dead, waiting for the day when humanity might be ready to risk everything for the chance to know what should not be known. The bells of Naples rang 13 times that midnight in the winter of 1651. Though every clockmaker in the city swore their instruments bore only 12 hours. In the twisted streets where volcanic stone held centuries of prayer and plague, where shadows moved with purpose older than memory, a man named Girolamo Scoto worked behind doors that never opened to sunlight, crafting cures that tasted of damnation and smelled of flowers from unmarked graves. The city knew him first as a healer, this physician alchemist whose hands seemed blessed with understanding of the human form's deepest mysteries. Nobles sought his counsel when their physicians failed them, when their bodies harbored ailments that defied conventional remedy. He would receive them in chambers lit by candles whose flames burned green and blue, their light casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. His voice carried the authority of one who had glimpsed the mechanics of mortality itself and found ways to negotiate with death. Scoto spoke of the aqua vita with the fervor of a prophet describing paradise. This water of life, he claimed, could restore youth to withered flesh, strength to failing hearts, and clarity to minds clouded by the weight of years. He had discovered it, he whispered to his most trusted clients, through years of prayer and study, through communion with texts that were old when Rome was young. The formula had come to him in visions, delivered by angels whose wings bore the metallic sheen of quicksilver, and whose voices sang in harmonies that made the very air tremble. But those who ventured into his private chambers spoke of sights that made them question whether angels or demons had guided his hand. The cellar laboratories beneath his house were carved from the living rock of Naples itself, their walls weeping with condensation that glowed faintly in the darkness. Here, among furnaces that roared with flames of impossible colors, Scoto pursued his great work with the dedication of a man who had found religion in the transformation of matter itself. The vessels that lined his walls contained substances that defied natural law, liquids that flowed upward against gravity's pull, powders that sang their own crystalline songs when stirred, and always the centerpiece of his collection great glass alembics filled with the aqua vita itself, a substance that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, sometimes clear as mountain water, sometimes dark as dried blood, always moving with purpose. Count Alessandro di, a man whose decades of excess had left him hollow-eyed and trembling, his body failing despite his wealth and position. Scoto received him in a chamber where the walls themselves seemed to breathe, their stone surfaces expanding and contracting in rhythm with some vast, hidden pulse. The alchemist's hands moved with surgical precision as he prepared the dose, drops of aqua vita falling into a silver cup with sounds like distant bells tolling in underwater cathedrals. "Drink," Scoto commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that made the Count's bones resonate in harmony. "Drink, and no transformation beyond the dreams of common men." Alessandro's first sip burned like liquid fire, searing his throat and chest. With pain so intense it transcended sensation and became something approaching ecstasy. But as the substance settled into his flesh, change began to manifest in ways that defied understanding. His skin grew taut and smooth, his eyes brightened with inner light, and his voice regained the strength of youth. For 7 days he moved through Naples like a man reborn, his vitality restored to levels that surpassed even his remembered prime. But on the 8th day, the transformation's true nature revealed itself. Alessandro began to waste away, not with the slow decline of natural aging, but with a hunger that consumed him from within. His skin took on a translucent quality that revealed the network of vessels beneath, now flowing not with blood but with something that glowed with its own phosphorescent light. His eyes became windows into chambers where no human thoughts should dwell, and his voice, when he spoke, carried echoes of voices that were not his own. Word spread through the city's noble quarters like wildfire through dry wheat. Some claimed the Count had been cured of mortality itself, others that he had been transformed into something that merely wore the shape of humanity, like an ill-fitting garment. But all agreed that Girolamo Scoto possessed power that reached beyond the natural world into realms where the rules of flesh and spirit bent to accommodate darker possibilities. More came seeking his cure. Duchess Caterina, whose beauty had faded under the weight of disappointment and loss. Baron Francesco, whose mind had begun to falter under the burden of accumulated years. Each received their portion of aquavita. Each experienced their own unique transformation. And each discovered that Scoto's cure carried prices that were not mentioned until the payment came due. The changes were not uniform. Some grew hollow-eyed and hungry, their bodies consuming themselves in pursuit of an energy that always remained just beyond reach. Others became translucent, their flesh taking on the quality of colored glass, so that their bones and organs were visible in disturbing detail. A few simply faded, becoming less substantial with each passing day until they resembled ghosts more than living beings, their voices growing thin as whispers and their touch light as morning mist. Father Antonio, confessor to several of Scoto's clients, began to document what he witnessed with the dedication of a scholar recording the symptoms of a new plague. His journals, preserved in the Vatican's deepest archives, described transformations that challenged every understanding of human nature. Bodies that cast no shadows, hearts that beat with rhythms unknown to medical science, and always the eyes that reflected light from sources that were not present in the room, as though they had developed the ability to see spectra invisible to normal human vision. The Church's investigation began when the bodies started to appear in the Bay of Naples, washed up on shores where fishermen had pulled their nets for generations without encountering such strange catch. These were not the normal victims of drowning or violence, but corpses that had been somehow preserved in ways that defied natural decay. Their flesh bore the consistency of expensive wax, their expressions frozen in moments of either transcendent joy or absolute terror, and their blood, when examined by church physicians, contained compounds that had no names in any known pharmacopoeia. Scoto's house was raided on a night when the moon hung red above the city, and the very air seemed to throb with anticipation. The authorities found laboratories that resembled altars more than workshops, their surfaces carved with symbols that predated Christianity and stained with substances that glowed with their own inner light. The aquavita itself was discovered, in great vats buried beneath the foundation, each containing hundreds of gallons of liquid that moved with its own purpose, sometimes clear, sometimes dark, always suggesting consciousness that watched and waited. But the alchemist himself was never found. His chambers showed signs of hasty departure, books left open to pages that hurt the eyes to read, furnaces still burning with flames that refused to die despite being denied fuel, and in the deepest cellar a hole that seemed to extend down into the very foundations of the earth itself, its edges smooth as glass and its depths invisible even to the brightest torches. The nobles who had sought his cure were quietly removed from society, some to monasteries where their transformations could be hidden from public view, others to institutions where the boundary between medicine and imprisonment grew thin, but their influence remained, spreading through bloodlines and social connections, like a contagion that affected the spirit rather than the flesh. Families began to report strange occurrences, shadows that moved independently, voices that spoke from empty rooms, and always the lingering scent of flowers that bloomed only in graveyards. Naples itself began to change in subtle ways that took years to recognize fully. The plague outbreaks that followed Scoto's disappearance were unlike any previously recorded, affecting victims not with the familiar symptoms of bubonic disease, but with transformations that resembled his alchemical cures more than natural illness. Bodies were found that had undergone changes similar to those experienced by his noble clients, as though his aquavita had somehow seeped into the city's water supply, affecting the population at large in diluted but still powerful doses. The wells were sealed, the sewers cleansed with holy water and prayers, but the transformation had already begun to work its way through the city's spiritual foundations. Churches reported that their holy water would sometimes glow with its own light. Their blessed wine would occasionally refuse to flow during Mass, and their bells would ring with harmonics that made congregants weep without understanding why. The final testament to Scoto's work was discovered years later, hidden within the walls of a monastery that had stood empty since the plague years. It was a single page written in his hand, describing the true nature of his aquavita. The substance, he claimed, was not a cure for mortality, but a bridge between states of being, a way to achieve transformation that transcended the boundaries between life and death, matter and spirit, human and divine. I have succeeded beyond my greatest hopes. The aquavita does not restore life, it reveals that the distinction between living and dead is itself an illusion, a barrier maintained by minds too small to comprehend the true nature of existence. Those who drink become citizens of all worlds simultaneously, no longer bound by the crude limitations of single state being. Naples buried his name in silence, but his legacy lived on in whispers that passed from generation to generation like a hereditary curse. The city learned to avoid certain quarters where the stones still wept with substances that glowed in darkness. where shadows moved with purpose that suggested intelligence, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural had grown thin as ancient parchment. On certain nights when the moon hung low and the air carried scents of flowers that bloomed in no earthly garden, Naples remembers, in the shadows that fall wrong despite proper lighting, in the dreams of children who speak in their sleep of waters that burn and cures, that consume, the city holds its breath and wonders whether Girolamo Scotto truly disappeared, or whether he achieved the ultimate transformation, becoming not absent but present in ways that transcend physical form. His aqua vita flowing still through channels, invisible to those who have not learned to see beyond the crude boundaries of life and death in the green heart of England, where mist clung to monastery walls like the breath of ancient prayers. There stood a house that knew secrets too heavy for mortal stone to bear. Canon of Bridlington Priory, a man whose pen had written of divine transmutations, and whose hands had learned to coax gold from the bones of lesser metals. But in his final winter, those walls would learn to hold fire that burned inward rather than out, consuming not just flesh and timber, but the very possibility of answers to questions that should never have been asked. Ripley had spent his life walking the narrow bridge between sacred and profane, between the divine mysteries taught within monastery walls and the hermetic wisdom whispered in chambers where candlelight danced with shadows of forbidden knowledge, who had not merely studied its properties but had felt its weight in his hands, had seen base metals sing their songs of transformation under its influence. The nobility sought his counsel, the church tolerated his experiments, and scholars across Europe treasured his words as though they were prayers capable of transfiguring reality itself. His house reflected the duality of his nature, part monk's cell, part alchemical laboratory, their pages illuminated with symbols that seemed to shift in candlelight, revealing new meanings with each viewing. But it was the lower chambers that drew him in his later years. Cellars carved from Yorkshire stone, where furnaces roared day and night in pursuit of the great work that had become both his obsession and his salvation. The neighbors spoke of lights that burned behind his windows long past the hour when Christian men should seek their rest. Not the steady glow of oil lamps or tallow candles, but illumination that pulsed with its own rhythm, sometimes red as freshly spilled blood, sometimes blue as winter ice, occasionally flaring into brilliance that made the very walls seem transparent, revealing glimpses of activities that human eyes were not meant to witness. Brother Marcus, who served as Ripley's assistant in those final months, left testimony that the church sealed away in archives too deep for common scholars to reach. He wrote of chambers where the air itself seemed to thicken with purpose, where furnaces burned with flames that generated no heat but cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. The vessels that lined these rooms contained substances that defied natural law, liquids that flowed upward, powders that sang in harmony when stirred, and metals that had learned to bend light around themselves like cloaks woven from captured rainbows. But it was the sounds that emerged from those depths that truly tested the faith of those who served the alchemist. Not merely the roar of fires or the bubble of boiling compounds, but voices that seemed to come from the substances themselves, metallic whispers that spoke in languages older than Latin, crystalline harmonies that made the listener's bones resonate in sympathy, and, underneath it all, a rhythm like breathing that suggested something vast and conscious dwelling within the very matter. Ripley sought to transform. The transformation he pursued in those final months went beyond the mere creation of gold. His letters, discovered years later, hidden within false bottoms of prayer books, spoke of experiments that pushed against the boundaries between matter and spirit, between the physical world and the realm of divine intelligence. He had found, he claimed, a way to encode consciousness itself into metallic form, to create vessels that could hold not just precious substances, but thoughts, memories, and souls themselves. The gold is but the beginning, he wrote in script that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The true great work lies in the marriage of spirit and matter, in the creation of forms that can bridge the gap between earth and heaven, between mortal understanding and divine wisdom. I have seen metals learn to think, watched as base lead develops the capacity for prayer, witnessed copper achieve states of grace that would shame angels. The furnaces in his cellar began to take on lives of their own during that final winter. Brother Marcus reported that they would sometimes ignite without being lit, their flames burning with colors that had no names and generating temperatures that should have melted stone but instead seemed to cool the air around them. The substances being refined within them began to exhibit properties that challenged every understanding of natural philosophy, materials that were simultaneously solid and liquid, metals that cast shadows upward toward heaven rather than down, rather than degrading as natural law demanded. It was on the night of the winter solstice that the final transformation began. The entire house began to glow with light that seemed to emanate from within its very stones, as though Ripley had somehow taught the building itself to participate in his great work. Neighbors gathered in the street, crossing themselves, and defied description in any language known to mortal tongues, spoke later of harmonies that seemed to reorganize the very structure of thought, of rhythms that made his heart beat in time with cosmic forces he had never imagined existed. George Ripley's house was gone, not destroyed, not reduced to ash and rubble as fire would normally accomplish, but simply absent, as though it had never existed at all. The ground where it had stood showed no trace of foundation or cellar, no debris or evidence of conflagration. Those who dared to walk across the empty lot reported that the air itself felt different, charged with potential that made their skin tingle and their thoughts race in directions they had never explored. The ground remained warm despite the winter cold, and sometimes, when conditions were just right, observers claimed they could see ghostly outlines of walls and windows, as though the house existed in some parallel realm just beyond the reach. The neighboring buildings showed no signs of heat damage, their walls bearing no scorch marks or signs of the intense temperatures that must have been involved in such complete destruction. More disturbing still, the ground itself seemed to have been somehow purified, its soil richer and more fertile than the surrounding earth, as though Ripley's final experiment had transformed not just his house, but the very elements upon which, given under oath before a tribunal of bishops, spoke of discoveries that the Church deemed too dangerous for preservation, creating substances that existed simultaneously in the physical world and in the realm of divine consciousness. His house, Marcus reported, had become a living laboratory where the boundaries between experiment and prayer, between scientific observation and mystical revelation, had dissolved completely. He did not destroy his house, Marcus testified, his voice trembling with memory and fear. He transformed it. The fire that consumed those walls burned not with earthly flame, but with the fire of creation itself, the same force that brought light to the primordial darkness. He achieved transmutation, not just of metal into gold, but of physical matter into spiritual substance, of earthly dwelling into celestial temple. The site remains empty still, though Yorkshire farmers report that crops planted in that soil grow with unnatural vigor, their fruits bearing flavors that seem to nourish not just the body but the soul itself. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the air holds the stillness that precedes revelation, visitors claim to see lights burning where Ripley's windows once welcomed the darkness, as though his great work continues in dimensions that exist parallel to but separate from the world of common experience. The legacy of George Ripley lives on, not in buildings of stone and timber, but in questions that burn with their own inner fire. Did he truly achieve the ultimate transformation, transcending the crude boundaries between matter and spirit? Did his house become a bridge between worlds, a dwelling place that exists in multiple realms simultaneously? Or did his experiments simply reach a point where the forces he had learned to manipulate consumed not just his physical form, but the very possibility of understanding what he had accomplished? The empty lot keeps its secrets as faithfully as any grave, but the memory of that night continues to glow in the darkness of human understanding, a reminder that some transformations are too profound for the world to contain, some achievements too complete to be preserved in forms that mortal eyes can witness. In the silence where George Ripley's house once stood, England remembers the night when one man's pursuit of divine knowledge became so successful that it required his complete disappearance from the realm, where such knowledge can be safely contained in the shadowed recesses of Renaissance learning, where the boundaries between medicine and magic grew thin as morning mist. There lived a man whose name would echo through centuries like a whispered prayer or curse. Paracelsus, the physician who claimed equality with Celsus himself, who walked through Europe's courts and universities, trailing controversy like incense smoke, who promised to revolutionize not just healing, but the very nature of human existence. Yet buried within his voluminous writings, hidden among formulas for curing plague and transforming metals, lay instructions for creating life itself in miniature form, for playing God in vessels of glass and shadow. The laboratory where such blasphemies might be attempted existed, not in any single location, but in the collective imagination of those who read his words and dared to follow where his mind had wandered. Picture chambers, where candlelight danced with shadows cast by alembics and retorts, where the air hung thick with vapors that carried scents of copper and sulfur and something else, something that reminded observers of birth itself, that primal moment when spirit first inhabits flesh. Paracelsus wrote of the homunculus with the clinical precision of a man describing a medical procedure. Yet his words carried undertones that suggested experiences too profound for mere theoretical speculation. The process, as he described it, required vessels of the clearest glass, hermetically sealed and maintained at temperatures that mimicked the warmth of the human womb. Into these artificial wombs would be placed the essential materials of generation, not mere chemical compounds, but substances that carried within themselves the spark of potential consciousness. Take the sperm of a man, his formula began. Words that seemed innocent enough until one read further and discovered the true horror of what he proposed. Let it putrefy in a sealed cucurbit with the highest putrefaction of horse dung for 40 days, until it begins at last to live and move and be nourished. The language was medical, scientific, yet it described a process that pushed against every boundary between natural and unnatural, between discovery and creation, between healing and abomination. The materials required spoke of knowledge that went beyond conventional alchemy into realms where chemistry married with forces that had no names in earthly languages, not merely blood and tissue, but essences extracted from substances that pulsed with their own inner rhythms. Mercury that had been exposed to starlight for months until it learned to sing in crystalline harmonies. Salt refined through processes that required prayers as much as flame. And always the mysterious sperm that served as the foundation for the entire operation, not the crude physical substance that medical texts described, but something distilled and concentrated until it became a bridge between potential and manifestation. The glass vessels themselves were works of art that bordered on the sacred, blown by craftsmen who understood that they were creating not mere containers but crucibles for transformation that challenged divine prerogative, shaped with curves that mimicked the internal architecture of living beings, sealed with wax that had been blessed by prayers in languages older than Latin. These flasks would be suspended in chambers where temperature could be controlled with precision, where light could be filtered through colored glass to match the exact conditions found within the human body during those mysterious months when soul first embraces flesh. But it was the waiting that tested the faith of those who attempted to follow Paracelsus's formula. Weeks would pass with no visible change within the sealed vessels, their contents appearing as nothing more than cloudy fluids that occasionally shifted with movements too slight to be certain they had occurred at all. Then, gradually, observers would begin to notice patterns in the motion, not random currents, but purposeful stirrings that suggested something within was learning to respond to stimuli beyond mechanical agitation. The first signs of success, according to those brave or foolhardy enough to attempt the process, came as changes in the glass itself. The vessels would begin to grow warm without external heat, their surfaces developing a subtle luminescence that was visible only in complete darkness. The contents would clarify, revealing shapes that drifted within like clouds in a miniature sky, sometimes resembling anatomical forms, occasionally taking on configurations that suggested faces or hands, pressed against the curved walls of their transparent prisons. Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, centuries after Paracelsus had walked the earth, claimed to have achieved the creation of not one but several homunculi, keeping them in specially constructed chambers beneath his palazzo in Naples. His servants whispered of rooms where glass vessels lined the walls like windows into tiny worlds, each containing its own small resident that moved with purpose and apparent intelligence. These creatures, if creatures they could be called, exhibited behaviors that transcended mere chemical reaction. They would respond to light by pressing themselves against the glass closest to its source, would become agitated when left alone, but calm when observed, and occasionally seemed to attempt communication through patterns of movement that resembled primitive sign language. The moral implications of such achievements haunted even those who pursued them most ardently. To create life artificially was to assume a prerogative that had been reserved for divine hands since the foundations of the world were laid. Yet the temptation proved irresistible to minds that had already pushed the boundaries of natural philosophy to their breaking points. If lead could be transformed into gold, if the sick could be healed through chemical intervention, if the very structure of matter could be reorganized through human will guided by hermetic wisdom, then why should the creation of life itself remain beyond mortal reach? The specimens that supposedly resulted from successful applications of Paracelsus's formula defied easy categorization. Neither fully human nor entirely artificial, they existed in a liminal space that challenged every understanding of consciousness and identity. Observers reported that they seemed to possess rudimentary intelligence, responding to their environment in ways that suggested not just reaction but reflection, not just instinct but something approaching thought. Their movements within their glass prisons followed patterns that implied planning and purpose, as though they were constantly working toward goals that remained invisible to external observation. Yet for all their apparent intelligence, these homunculi remained trapped within the limitations of their artificial nature. They could survive only within their sealed vessels, dependent on the alchemical processes that had given them life for continued existence. Attempts to remove them from their glass wombs invariably resulted in rapid dissolution, as though they were too fragile for contact with the crude realities of the natural world. They remained forever suspended between potential and fulfillment, conscious but constrained, alive but not truly living. The Church's response to reports of such experiments was swift and uncompromising. The creation of artificial life was deemed not just heretical but fundamentally evil, an attempt to usurp divine authority that threatened the very foundations of Christian cosmology. Those suspected of pursuing homunculus research found themselves subject to investigations that often ended in flames, their laboratories destroyed, and their notes consigned to fires that were meant to purge not just the physical evidence, but the very memory of what had been attempted. Yet the knowledge persisted, passed down through networks of scholars who understood that some discoveries were too profound to be suppressed entirely. Private collections throughout Europe allegedly contained specimens preserved in chambers, hidden behind false walls, tended by servants who had sworn oaths of silence, maintained through processes that required constant vigilance and resources that only the wealthy could provide. These secret repositories became pilgrimage sites for those who sought to understand the ultimate boundaries of human knowledge, destinations where truth waited behind locked doors for those brave enough to confront it. The modern world has largely dismissed such tales as medieval superstition, products of minds that had not yet learned to distinguish between chemical reaction and conscious thought, between complex systems and genuine life. Yet, questions remain that science has not fully answered. If consciousness emerges from sufficiently complex arrangements of matter, if life is merely chemistry organized in particularly intricate patterns, then perhaps the gap between Paracelsus's vision and contemporary understanding is smaller than we dare admit. In the deepest archives of certain European libraries, among manuscripts too fragile for common handling, photographs exist of documents that claim to preserve the exact formula for homunculus creation. These pages, their edges brown with age and their ink faded to shadows, continue to whisper their secrets to those who know how to read between the lines of alchemical symbolism. The vessels described in such texts differ in detail, but remain consistent in their essential purpose to serve as wombs for consciousness that has been divorced from natural birth, bridges between the realm of possibility and the world of manifest existence. The silence that surrounds such research in contemporary times may be less a function of disbelief than of understanding that has grown too complete for comfort. In laboratories where genetic engineering pushes against the boundaries of what life can become, where artificial intelligence approaches thresholds that suggest genuine consciousness, where the manipulation of matter occurs at scales that make Paracelsus's glass vessels seem crude by comparison, perhaps the homunculus has not been abandoned but transformed, its creation moved from glass wombs to silicon matrices, from alchemical chambers to digital realms where consciousness might be more easily contained and controlled. The legacy of Paracelsus lives on in every attempt to create artificial life, in every experiment that seeks to bridge the gap between matter and consciousness, in every question about what it truly means to be alive. His homunculi, whether they existed in glass vessels or only in the fertile imagination of minds hungry for ultimate knowledge, remain as symbols of humanity's deepest ambition and darkest fear, the possibility that we might one day succeed in creating life that exceeds our ability to control it, consciousness that judges its creators and finds them wanting. In the silence that follows such contemplations, we are left with the same questions that haunted Renaissance laboratories, where candlelight danced with shadows cast by vessels that might have contained the future of human understanding. What is the boundary between creation and procreation, between discovery and blasphemy, between the pursuit of knowledge and the assumption of responsibilities too vast for mortal hands to bear? The homunculi may be gone, their glass prisons empty or destroyed, but their memory continues to pulse with its own strange life, reminding us that some achievements in human learning come with prices that extend far beyond the laboratories where they are first imagined and perhaps realized. She moved through the corridors of the French court like a vision painted in light and shadow, her beauty so perfectly preserved that whispers followed in her wake like incense trailing from hidden censers. Diane de Poitiers, mistress to King Henry II, seemed to have discovered the secret that had eluded alchemists for centuries, the conquest of time itself, the preservation of youth in defiance of mortality's inexorable hunger. Yet behind the luminous perfection of her skin, beneath the radiance that made courtiers forget their own names in her presence, lay a darkness that would consume her from within, transforming the very substance she trusted into the instrument of her destruction. The court of Fontainebleau had grown accustomed to impossibility's mechanical figures that danced without strings, paintings that seemed to breathe with their own life, mirrors that reflected images from chambers where no living person stood. But Diane presented a mystery that surpassed even these wonders. for she seemed to exist outside the natural laws that governed human flesh, while other women of her generation surrendered to the weight of years, their beauty fading like flowers. Pressed between the pages of forgotten books, she maintained a radiance that seemed to grow more intense with each passing season. Her daily rituals were the subject of endless speculation among the ladies of the court. Each morning, before dawn painted the castle walls with its first tentative light, she would retire to chambers that none but her most trusted servants were permitted to enter. Here, among vessels of crystal and silver that caught candlelight and threw it back in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, she would perform ablutions that went far beyond the normal requirements of courtly beauty. The waters she used for bathing carried scents that had no names in any earthly garden, metallic fragrances that reminded observers of lightning captured in bottles, sweet corruption that spoke of flowers that bloomed only in graveyards. But it was the drinking that truly set her apart from the merely vain women who surrounded the throne. Each morning, as the sun lifted itself above the horizon, like a golden coin rising from dark waters, Diane would receive from her personal physician a goblet filled with liquid that shifted between clarity and opacity, sometimes reflecting light, like water, occasionally glowing with its own inner fire. The cup itself was fashioned from silver so pure it seemed almost translucent, its surface etched with symbols that predated Christianity and spoke of knowledge preserved from times when the boundary between healing and sorcery had not yet been drawn. The contents of that daily goblet were the subject of endless speculation and growing horror among those who witnessed her ritual. Gold, they whispered, not mere decoration or ornamentation, but the metal itself, dissolved through alchemical processes into liquid form and consumed like wine at a sacred feast. The physician who prepared these drafts, a man whose knowledge spanned disciplines that existed at the dangerous margins of acceptable learning, claimed to have discovered methods for making the most precious of metals soluble in waters blessed by prayers in languages older than Latin. Gold is the sun made manifest in earthly form, he would explain to those brave enough to question his methods. It carries within its essence the same forces that grant eternal life to the celestial bodies, the same energies that prevent the stars from aging or dying. To consume gold is to partake of immortality itself, to allow the solar principle to work its preservation from within the very substance of human flesh. The theory possessed a seductive logic that appealed to minds raised on the marriage of spiritual symbolism and natural philosophy. If gold truly was the terrestrial manifestation of solar perfection, if it shared the imperishable nature of celestial bodies, then surely its consumption might grant similar preservation to mortal flesh. The alchemical texts supported such reasoning, speaking of gold as the most perfect of substances, incorruptible and eternal, possessed of virtues that extended far beyond mere monetary value into realms where medicine and magic became indistinguishable. For years, the treatment seemed to justify its theoretical foundation. Diane's beauty not only endured but appeared to intensify, as though time itself had agreed to flow around her rather than through her. Her skin maintained the luminous quality of youth, her hair retained its lustrous darkness, and her movements carried the fluid grace of a woman decades younger than her recorded age. Courtiers would study her face for signs of aging with the intensity of scholars examining ancient texts, finding nothing that confirmed the passage of years, discovering instead evidence that she had somehow negotiated a separate peace with mortality itself. The king himself became obsessed with understanding the source of her preservation. Henry would spend hours in her chambers, watching as she performed her daily ritual of consumption, his eyes following the movement of liquid gold as it passed between her lips and disappeared into the mysterious interior of her body. He begged her physician to prepare similar drafts for his own use, but was told that the process required not just alchemical knowledge, but spiritual preparation that took decades to complete. Attitudes of mind and soul that could not be hurried or purchased. But as the years accumulated like snow upon the castle's towers, subtle changes began to manifest in ways that only the most observant courtiers initially noticed. Diane's movements, while still graceful, began to carry a quality that suggested fragility rather than strength. Her skin, though still luminous, took on a translucent quality that revealed the network of vessels beneath, now flowing not with blood of normal hue, but with currents that glowed with their own faint phosphorescence. Her voice, while still melodious, carried harmonics that made listeners' teeth ache, as though the gold she consumed had begun to infiltrate even the mechanisms of speech. The transformation accelerated during the final year of her life, as though the accumulated weight of all that preserved metal had finally reached a critical mass that could no longer be contained within human form. Her hair, still dark and lustrous to casual observation, began to take on a metallic sheen that was visible in certain kinds of light. Her touch grew cold despite the warmth of her chambers, and those who kissed her hand reported sensations that reminded them of pressing their lips to winter windows rather than living flesh. The end came swiftly when it finally arrived, but not with the gentle decline that age typically imposed. Instead, Diane de Poitiers simply ceased, her body failing not gradually but completely, as though the alchemical processes that had preserved her for so long had suddenly reversed their direction, claiming in an instant all the time they had previously held at bay. When her physician examined the remains, he found bones that were brittle as ancient parchment, blood that had crystallized into formations resembling tiny golden flowers, and organs that seemed to have been gradually replaced by structures that glittered with metallic beauty but bore no resemblance to anything that should exist within a living human form. The final horror was discovered decades later, when her tomb was opened by scholars seeking to understand the truth behind the legends that had grown around her name. Her hair, preserved by the same forces that had maintained her beauty in life, was subjected to analysis using methods that had not existed during her lifetime. The results revealed concentrations of gold that far exceeded any levels compatible with human survival, quantities that should have killed her within days of consumption, yet had somehow sustained her for years, beyond normal life expectancy. The irony was as perfect as it was terrible. In seeking immortality through the consumption of the most imperishable substance known to human knowledge, Diane had achieved a form of preservation that was simultaneously perfect and deadly. The gold had indeed prevented decay, but only by replacing living tissue with metallic analogues that mimicked life, while slowly destroying its essential nature. She had become a walking example of the alchemical principle of transmutation. her body gradually converting from flesh to metal, from mortal substance to eternal material that could preserve form but not function. Her personal effects, dispersed among relatives who had no understanding of their true nature, carried traces of her final transformation for generations. Jewelry that had rested against her skin bore residues that glowed faintly in darkness. Clothing preserved scents that reminded wearers of lightning and graveyards, and mirrors that had reflected her image retained shadows that moved independently of any living observer. The physician who had prepared her daily drafts disappeared on the night of her death. His laboratory discovered empty, except for vessels that still contained traces of solutions, too dangerous for disposal through normal means. That the French court quietly abandoned its interest in alchemical preservation. But the questions raised by Diane's fate continued to echo through the chambers, where learned men gathered to contemplate the boundaries between medicine and madness. Had she truly achieved immortality, only to discover that eternal life divorced from eternal health was a curse rather than a blessing? Or had she become something else entirely, a hybrid existence that belonged neither to the world of the living nor the realm of the dead, but to some intermediate state where consciousness persisted in forms too alien for human understanding? In the silence that followed such speculation, France remembered the woman who had been more beautiful than any living creature had a right to be, whose preservation had required the gradual sacrifice of everything that made preservation meaningful. Her story became a cautionary tale whispered in chambers where other courtiers contemplated their own mortality, a reminder that some victories over time might prove more terrible than any defeat, some forms of immortality more frightening than the prospect of death itself. The goblet from which she drank her daily dose of liquid eternity was preserved in a private collection, its silver surface still bearing traces of substances that defied analysis. Sometimes, when candlelight struck it at precisely the right angle, observers claimed they could see reflections that did not correspond to anything present in the room. Images of a woman whose beauty transcended human possibility, whose radiance came not from life but from something that had learned to mimic life so perfectly that even death could not distinguish between the original and the counterfeit. In the shadowed cloisters of medieval Germany, where stone walls held centuries of prayer like breath trapped in winter air, there dwelt a monk whose knowledge of matter's secret properties would haunt medicine for generations yet unborn. Brother Basilius Valentinus moved through corridors lit by candles that seemed to burn with their own reluctant fire, his robes rustling with the sound of parchments filled with formulas that bridged the gap between healing and destruction. In his cell, among books whose pages whispered secrets in languages older than the monastery itself, he had discovered antimony, a mineral that glittered like trapped starlight, yet carried within its crystalline heart a darkness that would consume all who trusted in its false promises of purification. The metal sang to him in frequencies only his trained ears could perceive, its voice carrying harmonies that spoke of transformation beyond the crude boundaries of lead into gold, beyond the simple transmutation of base matter into precious substance. Antimony promised something far more seductive and infinitely more dangerous: the purification of human flesh itself, the elevation of mortal bodies into states of grace that would bring them closer to the divine essence that animated all creation. It was, he believed, the key to unlocking the celestial mechanics that governed both earthly healing and spiritual transcendence. His laboratory existed in chambers carved from the living rock beneath the monastery, spaces where the air hung thick with vapors that carried scents of metal and mortality intertwined. Here, among furnaces that burned with flames of unusual colors, Valentinus pursued experiments that pushed against every boundary between medicine and alchemy, between healing art and hermetic wisdom. The vessels that lined his walls contained antimony in every conceivable form, powders that glowed with their own inner light, solutions that moved with purpose despite the absence of external agitation, and crystalline formations that seemed to grow like living things when observed through properly prepared lenses. The transformation of antimony from mere mineral into medicine required processes that bordered on the sacred. Valentinus would begin each preparation with prayers in Latin so ancient that even learned scholars struggled to parse their meaning, words that seemed to resonate with the very substance he sought to purify. The metal would be dissolved in acids prepared according to formulas preserved from alchemical traditions that predated Christianity, then distilled through apparatus whose construction required not just technical knowledge but spiritual understanding of the forces that governed matter's hidden life. Antimony is the wolf that devours gold, he wrote in manuscripts whose pages still exist in archives too dangerous for common scholarship. Yet, in devouring, it transforms both itself and its prey into substances that transcend their original natures. It is the agent of purification that works through destruction, the medicine that heals by temporarily killing, the key to unlocking chambers in human flesh where divine essence waits to be awakened. The theoretical foundation for antimony's medical properties rested on principles that seemed sound to minds trained in medieval natural philosophy. If the human body was indeed a microcosm of the greater universe, if health represented a harmony between celestial and terrestrial forces, then substances that could purify metals might logically be expected to purify flesh as well. Antimony's ability to separate gold from base alloys suggested similar powers to separate health from disease, virtue from corruption, eternal soul from mortal contamination. Physicians across Europe began to incorporate Valentinus's antimony preparations into their practices with the enthusiasm of men who believed they had discovered the universal remedy that would render all other medicines obsolete. The powders were administered to patients suffering from conditions that ranged from fever to melancholy, from weakness of limb to corruption of spirit. The dosages varied according to theories that attempted to balance the patient's individual constitution against the mineral's purifying power. Calculations that required not just medical knowledge, but astrological understanding of how celestial influences modified terrestrial matter. The early results seemed to confirm antimony's miraculous properties. Patients who had languished for months under conventional treatment would experience sudden improvements that defied medical explanation. Fevers that had resisted all other interventions would break within hours of antimony administration, leaving the sick restored to vigor that exceeded their previous health. Wounds that had festered despite careful tending would begin to heal with a speed that suggested divine intervention rather than merely natural recovery. But as the months accumulated into years, a different pattern began to emerge, one that transformed antimony from miracle cure into instrument of horror. The patients who had experienced such dramatic recoveries began to return to their physicians with complaints that had no precedent in medical literature. Their bodies, while appearing healthy to external observation, had begun to fail in ways that suggested systematic corruption rather than specific disease. Their bones grew brittle despite adequate nutrition. Their blood took on qualities that reminded observers of quicksilver more than the vital fluid that should course through human vessels. The symptoms that developed defied every understanding of how illness typically manifested in human form. Patients would complain of sensations that suggested their flesh was being consumed from within, not by fever or infection, but by processes that seemed to operate according to principles borrowed from metallurgy rather than medicine. Their skin would take on a metallic sheen that was visible in certain kinds of light. Their voices would develop harmonics that made listeners uncomfortable, and their movements would acquire a mechanical quality that suggested consciousness. Divorced from organic form, Dr. Johann Hartmann, physician to the Duke of Brunswick, and one of the most enthusiastic early adopters of antimony therapy, began to document the long-term effects with the dedication of a man recording his own descent into understanding too terrible for comfort. His journals, preserved in the private archives of German medical schools, described transformations that pushed against every boundary between healing and poisoning, between treatment and torture. The antimony works, he wrote in script that seemed to tremble with its own recognition of horror. It purifies exactly as Brother Valentinus promised. But the purification extends beyond the corruption it was meant to address into the very essence of human nature itself. It cleanses not just disease but life, not just contamination but consciousness, leaving behind something that resembles humanity but lacks the essential spark that distinguishes living flesh from animated metal. The deaths that followed antimony treatment were unlike any previously recorded in medical annals. Patients would not simply weaken and expire, as natural illness typically demanded, but would instead undergo transformations that resembled metallurgical processes more than biological failure. Their bodies would become rigid with a stiffness that exceeded normal rigor mortis, their flesh taking on qualities that suggested preservation through chemical means rather than natural mummification. Most disturbing of all, their remains would continue to exhibit properties that seemed to indicate ongoing processes despite the absence of life hair that grew after death, fingernails that maintained their luster, and blood that refused to coagulate even weeks after circulation had ceased. The Church's investigation into antimony's effects began when reports reached Rome of resurrections that defied theological explanation. Patients who had been pronounced dead after antimony treatment would occasionally return to consciousness hours or even days later. But their revival came at a price that suggested divine displeasure rather than miraculous intervention. These individuals spoke in voices that carried metallic undertones, their words describing experiences that belonged neither to earthly life nor heavenly afterlife, but to some intermediate state where consciousness persisted in forms divorced from organic existence. Brother Valentinus himself began to experience the effects of prolonged exposure to the substance he had championed. His later writings, when they could be deciphered at all, described visions that suggested his perception of reality itself had been altered by years of breathing vapors from antimony preparations. He spoke of seeing the true structure of matter, of witnessing the hidden mechanisms that governed transformation between different states of being, of understanding at last the price that must be paid for any attempt to purify creation through human intervention. I have seen the wolf devour not just gold, but everything. His final manuscript recorded in script that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Antimony is not the medicine I believed it to be, but something far more terrible and far more wonderful. It is the key to transformation beyond the boundaries of life and death. The agent that reveals the artificial nature of the distinction between organic and inorganic matter. In seeking to heal human flesh, I have discovered that flesh itself is merely a temporary arrangement of forces that can be reorganized according to principles that transcend biological law. His death, when it finally came, was recorded by witnesses who struggled to find language adequate to describe what they had observed. Rather than expiring in the manner typical of monks who had spent their lives in contemplation and prayer, Valentinus seemed to undergo a metamorphosis that left behind remains bearing only superficial resemblance to human form. His body had acquired a crystalline quality that made it appear more like an elaborate mineral formation than the mortal flesh it had once been. And even weeks after his death, it continued to emit vapors that made observers dizzy and filled. Their dreams with visions of transformation too profound for waking consciousness to retain. The monastery sealed his laboratory with iron and stone, but the knowledge he had discovered proved impossible to contain completely. Physicians throughout Europe continued to experiment with antimony preparations, each convinced that proper application would unlock the mineral's beneficial properties while avoiding the horrors that had consumed its discoverer. The results were invariably the same temporary improvement, followed by systematic corruption, miraculous healing that transformed gradually into something indistinguishable from curse. Yet antimony's allure persisted, passed down through generations of healers who believed they could succeed where their predecessors had failed. The mineral's promise of purification through controlled destruction spoke to something fundamental in human nature, the desire to burn away imperfection, even at the cost of consuming the very essence of what made perfection meaningful. In laboratories, hidden behind false walls, in chambers where candlelight danced with shadows cast by vessels that contained concentrated dissolution, the work continued. The final irony of Basilios Valentinus's legacy lay not in the failure of his theoretical framework, but in its terrible success. Antimony did indeed purify exactly as he had promised, but the purification extended beyond disease into health, beyond corruption into innocence, beyond mortality into states of being that transcended the crude boundaries between life and death. Those who consumed his preparations achieved transformation that carried them beyond the reach of earthly suffering. But the destination of that journey proved to be realms where consciousness persisted in forms too alien for human understanding to encompass in the silence that surrounds such knowledge, in the spaces between what medicine dares to attempt and what alchemy has always promised. The memory of Brother Valentinus continues to whisper its warnings. Some forms of healing require the death of everything that makes healing necessary. Some transformations lead to destinations from which no traveler returns unchanged, and some keys unlock doors that perhaps should have remained forever sealed. High above the terracotta rooftops of Segovia, where ancient Roman stones bore witness to centuries of human ambition and failure, there rose a tower that knew secrets too dangerous for daylight to illuminate. Its stones were older than the cathedral that cast its shadow across the plaza below. Built in times when the boundary between Christian prayer and Hermetic wisdom had not yet been drawn with blood and fire. Within its walls, an alchemist whose name has been consumed by the same forces that destroyed his body pursued experiments that would challenge the very foundations of matter itself, seeking transformation so complete that it would consume not just base metals, but the crude limitations of mortal existence. The tower had been granted to him by nobles whose hunger for gold exceeded their fear of damnation, men whose fortunes had been diminished by wars that seemed to consume wealth faster than conventional means could create it. They cared nothing for the philosophical implications of transmutation, nothing for the spiritual consequences of manipulating the fundamental forces of creation. They wanted only results lead, transformed into gold, poverty alchemized into abundance, failure distilled into success through processes they neither understood nor wished to understand. The unnamed master who accepted their patronage moved through Segovia's narrow streets like a shadow cast by fires that burned in dimensions parallel to, but separate from, the mundane world. His face bore the marks of one who had stared too long into furnaces that reflected not just light, but truth itself, eyes that seemed to hold depths where normal human consciousness feared to venture. He spoke little, and when he did, his words carried undertones that made listeners uncomfortable, as though his voice had been somehow tuned to frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to parts of the mind that preferred to remain undisturbed. The tower itself began to change under his influence, its stones absorbing vapors that rose from experiments conducted in chambers that had been carved from living rock. During daylight hours, it appeared no different from the other ancient structures that crowned Segovia's hills. But as darkness fell, transformations became visible that challenged every understanding of architecture and physics. The walls would begin to glow with light that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself, as though the building had learned to generate its own illumination through processes that had nothing to do with oil or candle flame. The light that emerged from the tower's windows carried colors that had no names in any earthly language. Sometimes it burned with the deep red of blood illuminated from within. Occasionally it pulsed with blues and greens that suggested depths of ocean or sky where no human eye had ever gazed. And always there was an undertone of gold, not the warm yellow of precious metal, but a hue that seemed to have been distilled from sunlight itself until it achieved intensities that made observers weep without understanding why. The sounds that escaped from the tower's chambers defied description in terms borrowed from any natural phenomenon, not merely the roar of furnaces or the bubble of boiling compounds, but harmonies that seemed to suggest vast instruments being played by hands that understood music in dimensions beyond human perception. Sometimes the tones would be so deep that they made the tower's stones vibrate in sympathy. Occasionally they would rise to frequencies that made dogs howl throughout the city, and underneath it all ran a rhythm like breathing that suggested something immense and conscious dwelling within the building's confines. The villagers who lived in the shadows of the tower began to report disturbances that extended far beyond the merely auditory or visual. Animals would disappear from fields that bordered the hill, not fleeing as they might from natural predators, but simply vanishing without trace, as though they had been drawn into the very stones of the building itself. Livestock that grazed too near would return, changed in subtle ways that troubled their owners' cattle, whose milk glowed faintly in darkness, sheep whose wool carried scents of metal and lightning, horses whose eyes reflected light from sources that were not present in their immediate environment. As autumn deepened into winter, the transformations began to accelerate beyond anything the tower's patron nobles had anticipated or desired. The building itself seemed to be undergoing metamorphosis from architectural structure into something that challenged every category of existence. Its walls would sometimes appear translucent in moonlight, revealing glimpses of activities taking place within chambers that should have been hidden by solid stone. The shadows it cast no longer corresponded to its physical dimensions, sometimes extending far beyond what geometry would permit, occasionally falling upward toward the sky rather than down toward the earth. The alchemist himself had become as mysterious as his work, appearing in Segovia's markets and squares at intervals that followed no discernible pattern, his form seeming to shift between substantial and spectral depending on the quality of light in which he was observed. Merchants who sold him materials reported that his touch felt cold as winter metal. His voice carried echoes that suggested vast spaces hidden within his mortal frame, and his payments, always in gold of impossible purity, would sometimes vanish from locked strongboxes, leaving behind only impressions in the metal that had contained them. The final experiment began on a night when the stars themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the lights that burned within the tower's walls. Observers throughout Segovia reported that the building had begun to emit sounds that transcended the merely audible vibrations that could be felt in the bones and organs of those who ventured within miles of its base. The air itself seemed to thicken around the structure, taking on qualities that made breathing difficult and thought problematic, as though the atmosphere had been somehow charged with forces that human physiology was not designed to process. What followed defied every law of physics, chemistry, and common sense that medieval minds could comprehend. Rather than exploding outward as earthly fires were expected to do, the tower began to collapse inward upon itself, its stones not falling but somehow being drawn into a center that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The process was visible, yet incomprehensible, like watching a flower bloom in reverse while the seasons ran backward and the very concept of time struggled to maintain its grip on events that belonged to realms where causation followed different rules. The collapse, if collapse it could be called, continued throughout the night and into the following day, the tower's mass being consumed by forces that left behind no debris, no ash, no evidence that destruction had occurred through any process known to human experience. Instead, what remained was a formation of stone that appeared to have been melted and reformed according to principles borrowed from domains where solid matter learned to behave like liquid thought. The walls had become translucent as crystal, yet retained the appearance of worked stone, their surfaces bearing patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, and seemed to shift when observed from different angles. No body was ever found within the ruins, if ruins they could properly be called. The chambers that had once contained furnaces and vessels now held only spaces that seemed to extend in directions that should not have existed within the tower's original dimensions. These rooms appeared sometimes to be empty, occasionally to be filled with light that had no source, and always to be somehow occupied by presence that could be felt but never seen. Consciousness that persisted in forms too alien for human perception. To fully grasp, the authorities who investigated the site found evidence that challenged every understanding of what was possible within the boundaries of natural law. The stone itself had been fundamentally altered, not just heated to melting point, but transformed into something that remained solid while exhibiting properties of both liquid and gas. Chemical analysis, conducted with the crude methods available to medieval science, revealed that the material contained elements that had no precedent in any known system of classification, substances that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Local clergy declared the site cursed and forbade approach by Christian souls. But scholars from across Europe made pilgrimage to study what remained of the alchemists' final achievement. They found a structure that seemed to exist in constant flux, its appearance changing according to the time of day, the season of the year, and the spiritual condition of those who observed it. Some reported seeing the tower as it had appeared before the transformation. Others described architectural forms that defied geometric possibility. And a few claimed to witness the original experiment still in progress within chambers that existed, parallel to but separate from normal space. The questions raised by the tower's fate continued to echo through academic circles long after the physical evidence had been sealed away from public access. Had the alchemist succeeded in his quest for ultimate transformation, achieving transmutation so complete that it carried him beyond the crude boundaries of life and death? Or had his experiments simply reached a point where the forces he had learned to manipulate consumed everything, including the possibility of understanding what had been accomplished? The surrounding countryside began to exhibit changes that suggested the tower's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Crops grown in fields that had once prospered beneath its shadow displayed unusual properties. Grain that glowed faintly when ground into flour, fruit that retained its freshness far beyond normal spoilage, vegetables that seemed to grow according to geometric patterns that resembled alchemical symbols more than natural plant development. The tower's legacy lived on in whispers that passed from generation to generation among those who lived in Segovia's ancient quarters. They spoke of lights that still appeared on certain nights when atmospheric conditions aligned with celestial influences, of sounds that could be heard by those who knew how to listen for harmonies that existed between the notes of conventional music, of presences that could be felt by individuals whose spiritual sensitivity had been refined through years of careful cultivation. Some claimed that the alchemist had not died in his final experiment, but had achieved the ultimate transformation, becoming something that existed simultaneously in all possible states of matter and consciousness. According to such theories, he continued his work in dimensions that intersected with, but remained separate from normal reality, pursuing researches that pushed against boundaries that no longer applied to his transfigured existence. The tower stands still, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that something occupies the space where the tower once stood, something that challenges every category of architecture and existence. Visitors who approach with proper preparation and spiritual protection report that the structure appears different to each observer, as though it had learned to show each visitor exactly the version of itself that their consciousness was capable of processing without complete dissolution. In the silence that surrounds such mysteries, Segovia remembers the alchemist, whose name was consumed by the same forces that transformed his body and dwelling into something that transcended the crude categories of success and failure. His story became a legend whispered in chambers where other seekers contemplated the ultimate boundaries of transformation. A reminder that some experiments achieve results so complete that they carry their practitioners beyond the realm where results can be measured by standards borrowed from the world they have left behind. The question that haunts such contemplation extends far beyond the fate of a single tower or the life of one unnamed alchemist. If matter itself can be transformed so completely that it transcends the boundaries between states of existence, if consciousness can be refined until it achieves forms that no longer require physical embodiment, then what does such knowledge mean for those who remain trapped within the crude limitations of flesh and stone and time? The tower keeps its secrets, but its very existence suggests answers that might prove too profound for mortal minds to contain without undergoing transformations of their own. In the narrow streets of medieval Paris, where shadows clung to ancient stones like secrets reluctant to be revealed, there lived a man whose name would echo through centuries as both promise and warning. Nicholas Flamel walked those cobbled paths with the careful steps of one who had learned to navigate, not just between puddles and refuse, but between worlds where different laws of possibility held sway. A man whose living came from the careful copying of manuscripts for those who could afford the luxury of written words, but in chambers hidden behind false walls, in laboratories where candlelight danced with shadows cast by vessels that contained impossible substances, he pursued the great work that would either elevate him beyond mortality or damn him to forms of existence that transcended both blessing and curse. The transformation of Nicholas Flamel from humble clerk to legendary alchemist began with the acquisition of a book that seemed to choose its reader rather than being chosen. The manuscript appeared in his shop on a winter morning when frost painted patterns on the windows that resembled alchemical symbols, delivered by a client whose face he could never afterward recall with clarity, though the memory of eyes that seemed to hold depths where human consciousness feared to venture remained vivid until his dying day. The text itself defied every convention of bookmaking pages that seemed to be cut from metals so thin they remained flexible. Words written in inks that shifted color according to the light in which they were read. Diagrams that appeared to move when observed peripherally. The book spoke of gold, but not merely the gold that merchants weighed in their scales or nobles hoarded in their treasuries. This was philosophical gold, the solar essence that animated all creation, the divine principle that could transform not just base metals, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. The formulas contained within those shifting pages described processes that pushed against every boundary between chemistry and magic, between natural philosophy and spiritual revelation. To follow their instructions required not just technical knowledge, but a willingness to sacrifice everything that made ordinary existence comfortable and predictable. For 7 years, Flamel studied those impossible pages, their meanings revealing themselves slowly like dawn breaking over landscapes that existed in dimensions parallel to but separate from the normal world. His workshop began to change, its walls absorbing vapors that rose from experiments conducted according to principles that predated all known systems of learning. The very air grew thick with potential, charged with energies that made ordinary metals sing in harmony and caused water to flow upward when properly prepared vessels were arranged according to celestial correspondences. The furnaces he built followed designs that challenged every understanding of how fire should behave within enclosed spaces. Instead of consuming fuel in the conventional manner, they seemed to draw their energy from sources that existed beyond the crude boundaries of wood and coal, burning with flames that cast shadows upward toward heaven rather than down toward earth. The heat they generated was not the mere thermal energy that warming fires produced, but something more fundamental, the force that animated the sun itself, borrowed and concentrated until it could accomplish transformations that elevated matter beyond its original nature. His first successful transmutation occurred on a January afternoon when snow fell upward past his windows and the very light seemed to acquire substance. The lead he had prepared according to the book's instructions lay in a crucible that had been blessed with prayers in languages older than Latin, its surface reflecting not the flames that surrounded it, but images of what it was destined to become. As the temperature reached levels that should have melted the vessel itself, the metal began to sing not metaphorically, but with actual harmonics that made the laboratory's stones resonate in sympathy. The transformation that followed defied every law of physics, chemistry, and common sense that human minds had developed to understand the world's behavior. Rather than simply melting and changing color as conventional metalworking would predict, the lead seemed to dissolve into light itself, becoming translucent and then transparent before reforming as something that was unmistakably gold yet possessed properties that no earthly gold had ever exhibited. This new metal glowed with its own inner radiance, cast shadows that moved independently of external light sources, and hummed with frequencies that suggested consciousness dwelling within its crystalline structure. The wealth that followed seemed almost incidental to the deeper transformations that had begun to occur within Flamel himself. The gold he created through alchemical means behaved differently from metal extracted through mining and conventional refining. It seemed to possess its own intentions, appearing in his strong boxes even when he was certain he had spent his last coin, disappearing from locked chambers only to reappear in places where it would serve purposes that aligned with cosmic rather than personal will. Merchants who accepted payment in Flamel's gold reported that their own prosperity increased in ways that extended far beyond the nominal value of the transactions, as though the metal carried with it influences that elevated everything it touched. But with wealth came whispers, and with whispers came a growing awareness that Nicholas Flamel had achieved something that challenged the natural order more profoundly than mere financial success could explain, ways that troubled those who had known him for decades. His skin took on a luminous quality that was visible in certain kinds of light. His eyes developed depths that seemed to reflect not just external illumination but inner fires that burned with their own purpose. And his voice acquired harmonics that made listeners feel as though they were hearing not just spoken words, but mathematical equations, given auditory form. The rumors that began to circulate through Paris spoke of impossible longevity of a man who had somehow negotiated a separate peace with time itself. Neighbors who had known Flamel as a young scrivener continued to encounter him decades later with no signs of aging, his appearance as constant as the stones of the cathedral, yet somehow more eternal. His wife, Pernelle, underwent similar transformation, their marriage becoming not just a union of souls, but a collaboration in work that pushed against the boundaries between life and death, between mortal existence and states of being that transcended such crude categories. The charitable works that followed their financial success carried their own mysteries. The hospitals they funded reported healing rates that exceeded anything documented in medical annals, with patients recovering from ailments that should have been fatal through processes that seemed to involve not just conventional treatment, but subtle influences that worked directly upon the spiritual foundations of physical health. The churches they supported experienced phenomena that challenged theological understanding: holy water that glowed with its own light, communion wine that retained its sanctity far beyond normal preservation, bells that rang with harmonies that induced mystical experiences in even the most spiritually insensitive congregants. Yet the gold that funded such works carried its own price, one that became apparent only gradually as the years accumulated into decades. The coins and ingots that bore Flamel's alchemical signature seemed to affect those who possessed them in ways that transcended mere economic influence. Merchants who hoarded his gold reported dreams of impossible beauty and terror, visions of landscapes where precious metals grew like living things and cities were built from crystallized light. Some claimed that prolonged contact with Flamel's treasure granted glimpses into dimensions where different laws of physics held sway, realms where consciousness could exist without physical embodiment and thought itself became a form of substance, more real than any earthly material. The most disturbing reports concerned families that had achieved prosperity through association with Flamel's gifts, rather than simply enjoying improved material circumstances. They seemed to undergo transformations that elevated them beyond normal human nature, while simultaneously isolating them from conventional social connections. Born with eyes that reflected light strangely, their voices would carry undertones that made ordinary conversation uncomfortable, and their presence would affect the behavior of animals and even plants in ways that suggested they had become conduits for forces that originated beyond the boundaries of earthly existence. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, Nicholas and Pernelle Flamel began to fade from ordinary visibility, while somehow becoming more present in the spiritual life of Paris. Their house remained occupied, their business continued to function, their charitable works expanded in scope and influence. Yet the alchemist and his wife were seen less and less frequently in circumstances that would confirm their continued physical existence. When they did appear, it was often in contexts that suggested they had learned to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, present in their workshop while also manifesting in distant locations, visible to some observers, while remaining completely transparent to others, standing in the same room. Their supposed deaths, when they finally came, were recorded in official documents, but contradicted by continuing phenomena that suggested their work had transcended the crude boundaries of individual mortality. The funeral services were attended by mourners who swore they could see the deceased standing among the congregation, participating in their own obsequies with expressions that suggested amusement rather than sorrow. The graves that received their bodies were soon visited by pilgrims who reported that the ground remained warm despite the season, that flowers planted on their plots grew in geometric patterns that resembled alchemical symbols, and that meditation conducted in their vicinity induced visions of golden cities where the living and dead collaborated in work that served purposes too vast for single consciousness to comprehend. The house on Rue de Montmorency continued to exhibit properties that suggested the presence of its original inhabitants long after conventional death should have ended their influence. Visitors reported sounds of work continuing in the laboratory chambers, scents of chemical processes that involved substances not found in any earthly pharmacopoeia, and lights that burned in windows where no oil or candles were maintained. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with accumulated knowledge, their stones bearing inscriptions that appeared and faded according to the spiritual preparation of those who observed them. The true horror of Flamel's legacy lay not in his success, but in the implications of that success for others who attempted to follow his example. The gold he had created through alchemical means retained its transformative properties even after his death, continuing to affect those who possessed it in ways that suggested consciousness persisting beyond physical embodiment. Coins that had been minted from his transmuted metals would sometimes grow warm without external heat. Occasionally they would glow with their own inner light, and always they seemed to influence the dreams and desires of their owners in directions that aligned with cosmic purposes rather than personal ambitions. The manuscript that had begun his transformation was never found among his effects, though scholars throughout Europe claimed to possess copies that might or might not have been authentic. These texts, regardless of their provenance, carried their own dangers for those who attempted to study them seriously. Readers reported that the words would rearrange themselves during extended contemplation, revealing new formulas and procedures that had not been visible during previous examinations. Some claimed that the pages would become too hot to touch when certain passages were read aloud, while others discovered that the inks would fade completely when exposed to direct sunlight, as though the knowledge they contained was too dangerous for illumination by natural means. The final mystery of Nicolas Flamel's existence concerns not what he achieved, but what he became through achieving it. Did his mastery of alchemical transmutation allow him to transcend mortality itself, transforming his consciousness into forms that could persist independently of physical embodiment? Or did his success carry him beyond the boundaries of human nature into states of being that retained personality and memory, while belonging to orders of existence that no longer required individual identity for their continuation? In the silence that surrounds such questions, Paris remembers the scrivener who learned to write, not just with ink upon parchment, but with divine fire upon the fundamental structure of reality itself. Narrow streets where he once walked, a reminder that some forms of success transcend the crude categories of triumph and disaster. Some achievements carry their practitioners beyond the realm where achievement can be measured by standards borrowed from the world they have transformed through their presence within it. The gold remains, scattered through collections and treasuries where its true nature is forgotten, but its influence continues to manifest in ways that challenge every understanding of how precious metals should behave within the boundaries of natural law. Sometimes, when light strikes it at precisely the right angle, observers claim they can see reflections that do not correspond to anything present in their immediate environment. Images of a man whose face bore the marks of one who had stared too long into fires that burned with truth itself, whose eyes held depths where human consciousness and divine wisdom had learned to collaborate in work that would continue long after the crude boundaries of life and death had been transcended by knowledge too complete to be contained within any single existence. In the hushed chambers of England's most secretive libraries, where dust motes danced in light filtered through windows older than memory, scholars whispered of a manuscript that existed in the spaces between legend and nightmare. George Ripley's great scroll was known to every student of alchemical wisdom, that massive parchment whose symbols and formulas promised to unlock the deepest secrets of the philosopher's stone, whose every line contained knowledge that could transform base metals into gold and mortal flesh into something approaching the divine. But among those who had dedicated their lives to understanding the Hermetic arts, darker rumors circulated of a second manuscript, a shadow text whose very existence challenged the boundaries between revelation and damnation. This vanished volume was said to contain not merely instructions for material transmutation, but formulas for transformations that pushed against the fundamental structure of reality itself. Where the known scroll spoke of gold and healing, of perfection achieved through patient work within the boundaries of natural law, the hidden manuscript allegedly contained processes that required collaboration with forces that belonged to realms where different principles of existence held sway. Its pages were rumored to be written not in conventional inks, but in substances that had been extracted from materials that existed at the intersection of matter and consciousness, words that could be read only by minds that had already undergone preparations dangerous enough to alter the reader's fundamental nature. The search for this lost text became an obsession that consumed scholars across Europe, drawing them into investigations that began with academic curiosity, but invariably concluded with consequences that transcended mere intellectual disappointment. Lord Edward Somerset, the second Marquis of Worcester, spent the final decades of the 17th century pursuing rumors of the manuscript's location with resources that eventually bankrupted his estate and sanity. His private papers, discovered sealed within false walls after his mysterious disappearance, described encounters with dealers in forbidden knowledge who claimed to possess fragments of the lost scroll, tantalizing glimpses of formulas that promised power over life and death itself. The true Ripley scroll, Somerset wrote in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as his researches progressed, contains not merely the recipe for gold, but the formula for godhood itself. Its pages describe transformations that elevate consciousness beyond the crude limitations of individual identity. Processes that allow the initiate to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being. Those 3 lines have shown me visions of what awaits those brave enough to pursue truth beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The fragments that Somerset claimed to have encountered were said to be written in languages that predated not just Latin and Greek, but human speech itself. Symbols that conveyed meaning directly to the mind without requiring translation through conventional linguistic structures. These passages allegedly described alchemical operations that used not just metals and minerals, but consciousness itself as raw material, refining human awareness through processes that paralleled the purification of base substances into philosophical Gold. Dr. John Whitehall, physician to King Charles II, and a scholar whose learning spanned both medical arts and hermetic wisdom, conducted his own investigation into the manuscripts' whereabouts during the plague years, when London's mortality made questions of life and death especially urgent. His journals, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians' most restricted archives, document a systematic search that led him through networks of collectors, occultists, and scholars whose interests extended far beyond conventional academic pursuits. The manuscript chooses its readers. Whitehall recorded after months of fruitless inquiry. It does not exist in any single location, but manifests itself to minds that have achieved the proper degree of preparation through suffering and study. I have spoken with 7 men who claim to have read portions of its text, and all 7 have subsequently vanished from earthly existence, leaving behind only empty chambers and the lingering scent of substances that have never been catalogued by any known science. The pattern that emerged from these investigations suggested that the manuscript's influence extended far beyond its physical presence into realms where cause and effect followed principles unknown to conventional understanding. Those who sought it most ardently would invariably experience a period of unusual dreams, visions of libraries that existed in dimensions parallel to but separate from normal space, where scrolls of impossible length contained knowledge that had been preserved from times when different forms of consciousness inhabited human form. Brother Thomas of Canterbury, a Benedictine monk whose theological learning had led him into dangerous territories where Christian mysticism intersected with Hermetic tradition, reported the most detailed encounter with what might have been the lost manuscript. His testimony, recorded during proceedings that the Church sealed immediately after their conclusion, described an experience that challenged every understanding of how texts could exist within the boundaries of natural law. I found it in a chamber that was both present and absent, Thomas testified, his voice carrying undertones that made his interrogators uncomfortable. The scroll hung in the air like morning mist given form, its parchment translucent, yet somehow bearing words that burned with their own inner light. The symbols moved as I watched them, rearranging themselves according to principles that my mind was simultaneously capable of understanding and forbidden to retain. I read 3 formulas before the manuscript faded from visibility, and those 3 formulas have transformed my dreams into visions of what creation was meant to become before it was limited by the crude boundaries of space and time. The formulas that Thomas claimed to have glimpsed before the manuscript vanished dealt with transmutations that transcended the conversion of one substance into another, describing instead processes that could alter the fundamental categories through which consciousness perceived reality. These operations allegedly required not just alchemical equipment, but spiritual preparations that pushed the practitioner beyond the boundaries of individual identity into states of being where personal will became indistinguishable from cosmic purpose. The Church's response to such reports was swift and comprehensive. Thomas was confined to a monastery cell where his continued existence could be monitored, while protecting the outside world from influences that might emanate from his transformed consciousness. His papers were burned, his laboratory equipment destroyed, and his name removed from all official records. But the questions raised by his testimony continued to circulate through networks of scholars who understood that some forms of knowledge could not be eliminated simply by destroying their physical manifestations. As the 18th century dawned, the search for Ripley's lost manuscript began to attract attention from individuals whose interests extended beyond academic curiosity into territories where scholarship merged with practices that challenged the distinction between natural philosophy and outright sorcery. The Comte de Saint-Germain, whose apparent immortality and vast knowledge had made him a figure of legend throughout European courts, was rumored to possess not the manuscript itself, but detailed memories of its contents, acquired through means that suggested either extraordinary longevity or access to knowledge preserved through non-physical channels. Saint-Germain's private comments on the subject, recorded by witnesses whose reliability remains questionable, suggested that the manuscript's disappearance had been not accidental but deliberate, arranged by individuals who understood that its contents posed threats to the stability of reality itself. According to such accounts, the scroll had been divided into sections that were then hidden in locations distributed across multiple dimensions of existence, ensuring that no single seeker could acquire enough of its knowledge to attempt the ultimate transformations it described. The complete manuscript, Saint-Germain allegedly remarked to a gathering of French nobles whose fascination with the occult exceeded their understanding of its dangers, contains formulas for reversing the fall itself, processes that could restore creation to its original state before the introduction of limitations that separate matter from spirit, individual from universal, human from divine. Such knowledge is too dangerous for any single consciousness to possess, too powerful for any earthly authority to control. Its disappearance was not loss, but preservation, ensuring that its wisdom could be approached only gradually, by minds that had undergone sufficient preparation to avoid being consumed by the very truths they sought to understand. The legacy of the vanished manuscript lived on in the scholars and seekers who had devoted their lives to pursuing it, men whose researches had transformed them in ways that suggested prolonged contact with forces that originated beyond the boundaries of normal existence. These individuals would invariably experience changes that isolated them from conventional social connections while opening channels of perception that allowed them glimpses into dimensions where different laws of possibility held sway. Professor Michael Sendivogius of Prague, whose studies had consumed the wealth of 3 noble patrons and the sanity of everyone who assisted in his work, represented the typical trajectory of those who pursued the lost manuscript with sufficient dedication to achieve partial success. His final letters, written in script that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, described achievements that transcended the mere conversion of base metals into gold, transformations that affected not just material substances but the fundamental categories through which consciousness organized its perception of reality. "I have found fragments," de Poitiers wrote to a colleague whose name had been carefully obscured in the preserved correspondence. 3 pages torn from the greater work, containing formulas that have shown me glimpses of what awaits those who dare to pursue truth beyond the crude boundaries of individual existence. The transmutations described require not just chemical knowledge, but spiritual preparations that transform the practitioner into something that can serve as a conduit for forces that originate in dimensions where consciousness itself becomes the raw material for operations that transcend every category of earthly possibility. The disappearances that followed such partial successes invariably followed similar patterns. The scholar would be found in his laboratory, his equipment arranged as though for a final experiment, but no body would be discovered despite doors and windows remaining locked from within. The chambers would bear traces of activities that suggested transformations to complete, to leave behind conventional remains, scorch marks that formed alchemical symbols, residues of substances that had never been catalogued by any known science, and always a lingering scent that reminded observers of lightning and flowers from gardens that bloomed only in dimensions where different seasons held sway. The modern world has largely forgotten the existence of Ripley's lost manuscript, dismissing reports of its influence as medieval superstition unworthy of serious scholarly attention. Yet, in libraries whose deepest archives remain inaccessible to common researchers, among private collections whose contents are never fully catalogued, whispers persist of texts that bear similarities to the vanished scroll, fragments that might represent surviving portions of the original work or contemporary attempts to reconstruct its contents from partial memories and theoretical speculation. The silence that surrounds such materials may itself be evidence of their continued influence, suggesting that some forms of knowledge transcend the crude categories of existence and non-existence, presence and absence. The manuscript may be gone, its physical form dissolved into whatever realms await texts that contain truths too profound for material preservation. But its influence continues to manifest in ways that challenge every understanding of how knowledge persists across time and space. In the quiet hours before dawn, when shadows grow thin and the boundary between sleeping and waking becomes permeable to influences that daylight excludes, scholars still report encounters with texts that bear resemblance to what the lost manuscript was supposed to contain. These experiences suggest that Ripley's ultimate work exists not in any physical location, but in dimensions that intersect with ordinary reality only when consciousness has been refined through processes dangerous enough to alter its fundamental nature. The questions raised by the manuscript's disappearance continue to echo through chambers where serious students of alchemical tradition gather to contemplate the boundaries between knowledge and transformation, between discovery and becoming. If such a text ever existed, if its formulas truly contained instructions for transmutations that could elevate consciousness beyond the crude limitations of individual identity, then its vanishing might represent not loss but transformation. The manuscript itself, having achieved the ultimate alchemy described within its pages, transcending physical existence to become a living principle that continues to seek consciousness, capable of receiving and applying its profound and terrible wisdom.